Hello, I want to share an insight on the Makat Choshech, the plague of darkness, the ninth, and according to some, the most devastating of all the plagues. An article came out this week in the New Yorker called The History of Loneliness by Jill Lepore. Until a century or so ago, she writes, almost no one lived alone. Now, many endure shutdowns and lockdowns on their own. How did modern life get so lonely? She begins her article by noting that one of the first zoo in the States actually, was the Philadelphia Zoological Garden. It opened in 1874, 2 years after Charles Darwin published The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Of course, he compared the plight of humans to that of monkeys. If you look at the primates in the cages, so we could learn a lot. There was a Mr. and Miss Chimpanzee in the Philadelphia Zoo, and they were two of only 4 chimpanzees in America at the time. When Miss Chimpanzee died, so human observers mourned her loss. But, writes Lepore, above all, they remarked on the behavior of her companion. For a long time, they reported he tried in vain to rouse her, and then he went into a frenzy of grief. The paroxysm accorded entirely with what Darwin had described in humans. Persons suffering from excessive grief often seek relief by violent and almost frantic movements. The bereaved chimpanzee began to pull out the hair from his head. He wailed, making the sound the zookeeper had never heard before. Ha, ha, ee, ha. His cries were heard over the entire garden. He dashed himself against the bars of the cage and butted his head upon the hardwood bottom. And when this burst of grief was ended, he poked his head under the straw in one corner and moaned as if his heart would break. This grief that they observed in the zoo, the Superintendent Brown observed, who wrote a scholarly article at the time called Grief in the Chimpanzee, something which informs us in our own human behavior when we are confronted with this terrible plight of loneliness. But are we different from the chimpanzees? In Lepore's article, she ends with a cautionary and frightening line. She writes, in this era of shutdowns and social distancing lockdowns, human but inhuman zoological garden that we face, Zoom is better than nothing. But for how long? And what about the moment your connection crashes? The panic, the last tie severed. It is a terrible, frightful experiment, the test of the human capacity to bear loneliness. Do you pull out your hair? Do you dash yourself against the walls of your cage? Do you, locked inside, thrash, cry and moan, sometimes rarely or never? More today than yesterday. I want to share an insight from one of the former chief rabbi of Ireland, Rav Yaakov Perlman, who notes in his Haggadah on the verses, Lo ra'u ish achiv velo kamu ish mitachtav shloshes yamim. During the Makkah of Choshech, during the plague of darkness, one man and one woman, they didn't see one another for 3 days. They never laid eyes upon one another. Vayikra para el Moshe vayomer lechu ivdu es Hashem. Go and serve your God. Get out of here. So Rav Yaakov Perlman wonders, of all the plagues we faced, of all the various terrible makos that Mitzrim confronted, why now? Why does Paro relent now on Makas Choshech? Dam wasn't severe enough? All the drinking water, all the supplies turned to blood. You couldn't drink, you can't survive. The terrible physical endurance of the frogs, of the lice, the pestilence, the death of all of our... I just read an article that certain shecht houses are closing down, lo aleinu, if we run out of our food supply. Hashem yirachem aleinu. The terrible things that happened to the Egyptians. And Paro said no, each time stubbornly closed his heart to the possibility that he would have to release the Jewish people, his beloved workforce. But Makas Choshech arrives and Paro says no. Paro says yes, go ahead. What's Choshech after all, says Rav Perlman. They just sat there. They weren't enduring physical pain. They weren't suffering, they weren't dying, they could have just sat for 3 days. What's the big deal? In the grander scheme of things, is it such a big deal to not have light for a couple of days? Perlman says, don't you understand? Lo ra'u ish et achiv velo kamu ish mitachtav. They couldn't see one another anymore. Right, Sir Perlman, we know the expression Chazal tsaras rabim chetzi nechama. The pain of other people suffering with us is half the comfort. Rendered into the English expression, misery loves company. When you're suffering an ailment and you know that someone else is suffering, it's the best. When you know that someone else is going through what you're going through, we can endure. It's partially comforting to know that I'm not the only one whose life is a mess right now. But what happens when you can't see someone else? What happens when you are suffering and you don't know that other people are going through that as well, when you think you're the only one in the world? That's the sort of loneliness. That's the sort of misery that doesn't have the comfort of tsaras rabim. Lo ra'u ish et achiv. Nobody could see the fellow man. Nobody else knew there was another human being in the world. And for however long that endures, it's impossible. It's far too painful. And Paro says, Ad kan. You can throw anything you want at me, but do not put me in a cage alone. So what's the antidote to the loneliness that we are confronting today? The Rav pointed out that there's a profound difference between loneliness and alone. Loneliness is a terrible plight. No one should have to endure it. Nobody should ever feel that they have nowhere to turn to, that nobody cares, that nobody knows their pain. But to be alone is also, at times, a blessing. What the Rav referred to as ontological loneliness, a blessed, to be alone with your thoughts, to have a moment to think about who you are in this maddening world that is inundating with media and with messages and with advertisements and ideas and what the other person is doing. We can't think for ourselves anymore. But to be alone for a moment of quiet, to shut down the phones, to shut down the internet. I don't know about you, but Shabbos, the last few weeks, I hate to say it, it's been terrible without a tzibur. It's been terrible without shul, without our friends. And it's not what is intended. It's not what we want. But just for a second, let us admit there was something majestic about just being there and not being flooded with multiple stimuli all at once, hitting us, confronting us, bashing us over the head. And that dreadful moment when you turn on the phone, Motzei Shabbos, and you want to see how many people, lo aleinu, passed away in the last 24 hours. That frightening moment when you realize you're not alone. There's a blessing in disguise that we are confronting now in our moment of Choshech. Yes, there's solitude, and that's terrifying when nobody's there to help. But there's also a moment that we have to build up ourselves, to re-identify with our values, to remember who we are, who we wanted to be. Years ago, when I left yeshiva, I went to the Kotel one last time, and I cried before Hashem, and I asked him certain things that were personal, certain things that I was longing for. And I said, no matter what happens, Hashem, God, don't let me forget about these core values. Don't let me ever abandon who I am. Don't let me forget who I am when I'm alone. Maybe now is a time to turn inward and remember who we really are. Get back in touch with ourselves. And with that, we find the silver lining in this darkness, in this Makas Choshech, with which we have been confronted. I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom and remind you that this Motzei Shabbos, I'll be giving my Shabbat HaGadol Drosha on the topic of honor among thieves, understanding the messages, the hidden message of stealing the Afikomen. Motzei Shabbos, I'll be sending around as well the Zoom information, and it will be on Facebook Live. Looking forward to sharing that Torah with you and to sharing in many more smachot. Shabbat Shalom.